All along the Normandy coastline, the invasion surged forward. For the French caught in the chaos, these were moments filled with confusion, joy, and fear. In areas under heavy shelling, 82nd Airborne paratroopers noticed farmers calmly working in the fields as if nothing unusual was happening. Occasionally, one of them would be hit, either wounded or killed. In the town, paratroopers watched a local barber take down the sign "Friseur" and replace it with "Barber." A few miles away in the coastal hamlet of La Madeleine, Paul Gazingal was wounded during the shelling and was bitter and in pain. The roof of his store and cafe had been blown off. Now, American 4th Division troops were escorting him and 7 other men to Utah Beach. Gazingal's wife, distressed, asked the young lieutenant where they were taking her husband. The officer, speaking perfect French, replied that they needed to question him and couldn't do it here. They were taking him and the others to England. Madame Gazingal was shocked. To England? What had he done? The officer looked uncomfortable and told her he was just following orders. She asked, tearfully, what would happen if he were killed in a bombing? The officer assured her there was a 90% chance he wouldn't be. Gazingal kissed his wife goodbye and was taken away, confused and unaware of the reason. He would return to Normandy 2 weeks later, told it had all been a mistake. In Grand Camp, a seaside town, Jean Marion, a French underground sector chief, was anxious. He could see the fleets off Utah and Omaha beaches and new soldiers were landing, but it looked as if Grand Camp had been forgotten. No Allied troops had arrived. Then his wife pointed to a destroyer slowly maneuvering opposite the town. Marion recognized the move. He had sent London a message days earlier about a small artillery piece on the sea wall that could only fire to the left toward Utah Beach. The destroyer moved into the gun's blind spot and opened fire. Each blast confirmed to Marion that his warning had been heard. With tears in his eyes, he watched the destroyer, likely the USS Heron, blast the artillery until it exploded in a violent blast, ammunition and all. In the town of Bayeux, 15 miles away, Guillaume Mercader, the underground intelligence chief for the Omaha Beach area, stood at his window with his wife Meline. He was struggling not to cry. After 4 brutal years, the German troops stationed in the town seemed to be retreating. Distant cannon fire told him heavy fighting was underway. He wanted to rally his resistance fighters to drive out the remaining Nazis, but the radio had urged them to wait and avoid any uprisings. He had learned patience. "We'll be free soon," he told his wife. The townspeople of Bayeux felt the same. Though the Germans had ordered them to stay indoors, many had gathered in the cathedral courtyard to hear a priest's live updates on the invasion. From the steeple, the priest yelled down what he saw, including the beach activity. Among the listeners was 19-year-old kindergarten teacher Anne-Marie Brooks, who would later meet and marry an American soldier. At 7 a.m., she rode her bicycle toward her father's farm near Suresnes, passing German positions and machine gun nests. Some Germans waved. One warned her to be careful. Nobody stopped her. She saw planes strafing and Germans diving for cover. Her blue skirt billowing and her hair flying in the wind, she felt oddly safe, unaware of how much danger she was in. As she neared her destination, she began to feel afraid. Burned-out farmhouses and smoke marked the area. The gunfire grew louder. At the crossroads in Suresnes, fear fully set in. She carried her bicycle across the fields and finally spotted her father's farmhouse still standing. She ran the rest of the way and called out. The windows were shattered, the roof damaged, and the front door was wrecked. Suddenly the door opened and her parents stood there. She ran to them. Her father embraced her and said, "This is a great day for France." Anne-Marie burst into tears. Half a mile away, amid the horror of Omaha Beach, 19-year-old Private First Class Leo Hero was fighting for his life. He would become Anne-Marie's husband. Elsewhere in France, one of Normandy's top underground leaders, Leonard Gilles, was stuck on a train outside Paris, furious. As deputy military intelligence chief, he had been ordered to the capital just before the invasion. The journey was painfully slow. He heard about the landings from a porter, but didn't know exactly where they were happening. Trapped on the train until it reached Paris, he was bitterly frustrated. Meanwhile, back in Caen, his fiancée, Janine Bouard, had been busy since learning of the invasion at 7 a.m. She woke the two RAF pilots she had been hiding and told them they had to leave immediately. She planned to take them to a farm in the village of Gavris, 12 kilometers away. The two British pilots were shocked. They were so close to the front, yet they would be going inland, away from the coast. Wing Commander Keith Loft suggested they try heading north to meet the Allied troops, but Janine advised patience. The area between Caen and the beaches was full of German soldiers. Shortly after 7 a.m., dressed in farm clothes and carrying false papers, they set out on bicycles. They were stopped several times by German patrols but passed inspection. Once at Gavris, Janine's mission ended. The pilots were now another step closer to freedom. Janine wanted to go further with them, but needed to return to Caen to help the next downed airmen escape. In the prison at Caen, Madame Aimée Le Chevalier was expecting to be executed for helping Allied pilots. That morning, she heard a whisper as her breakfast was slid under the door. "Hope! Hope! The British have landed." She began to pray and wondered if her husband Louis, held nearby, had heard. The night's explosions had seemed like the usual bombings, but now maybe there was hope. Suddenly, she heard a commotion in the corridor. She got down and listened. Men were shouting, "Rouse! Rouse!" There was the sound of feet, cell doors slamming, then silence. A few minutes later, machine gun fire rang out. The Gestapo had panicked. Within minutes of hearing about the invasion, they had set up machine guns in the courtyard. Male prisoners were taken in groups of 10, lined up, and shot. The men were arrested for a range of reasons, some true, some false. Among them were farmers, shopkeepers, railway workers, a dentist, a fisherman, a town hall secretary, and a retired officer. Of the 92 executed, only 4 were part of the French resistance. None were given a hearing or trial. Among those killed was Madame Le Chevalier's husband, Louis. She had no idea what was happening and waited in fear as the gunfire continued for an hour. Anne-Marie is one of the few war brides who didn't move to the U.S. She and Leo Hérault live where they first met, at her family's farm near Suresnes, behind Omaha Beach. They have 3 children, and Leo runs a driving school in England. At 9:30 a.m., far away, General Eisenhower had been pacing all night in his trailer, waiting anxiously for news. He tried to relax by reading westerns, but couldn't focus. Finally, the first messages came in, fragmented but promising. His air and naval commanders were pleased with the progress. Allied troops had landed on all 5 beaches. Operation Overlord had begun successfully. A toehold was secured. There would be no need to call off the attack. It was just as well her American husband, Captain Edmund Duckworth of the 1st Division, had been killed as he stepped onto Omaha Beach. They had been married just 5 days. On the way to Eisenhower's headquarters at Portsmouth, Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Morgan heard the BBC warn listeners to stand by for a special announcement. Morgan told his driver to stop the car for a moment and turned up the volume on the radio. Then the author of the original invasion plan heard the news of the attack. For most of the United States, the report came in the middle of the night. On the East Coast, it was 3:33 a.m. On the West Coast, 12:33 a.m. Most people were asleep, but among the first to hear of D-Day were the thousands working the swing shifts. The men and women who had toiled to produce most of the guns, tanks, ships, and planes being used in the assault. Everywhere in the great pulsing war plants, work stopped for a moment of solemn reflection. In a Brooklyn shipyard, Under the harsh glare of arc lamps, hundreds of men and women knelt on the decks of partially finished Liberty ships and began to say the Lord's Prayer. Across the nation, in sleeping towns and villages, lights flashed on. Quiet streets filled with sound as radios were turned up. People woke their neighbors to tell them the news. So many phoned friends and relatives that telephone switchboards were jammed. In Coffeyville, Kansas, men and women in their nightclothes knelt on porches and prayed. On a train between Washington and New York, a clergyman was asked to hold an impromptu service. In Marietta, Georgia, people thronged into churches at 4 a.m. The Liberty Bell was rung in Philadelphia. Throughout historic Virginia, the home of the 29th Division, church bells tolled in the night just as they had during the Revolution. In Little Bedford, Virginia, the news had a special significance. Nearly everyone had a son, brother, sweetheart, or husband in the 29th. In Bedford, they did not yet know, but all of their men had landed on Omaha Beach. Out of 46 Bedford men in the 116th Regiment, only 23 would come home again. Lois Hoffman, wife of the skipper of the Corrie, was on duty at the Norfolk, Virginia Naval Base when she heard about D-Day. From time to time, she had kept track of her husband's destroyer through friends in the operations room. The news held no personal significance for her. She still believed her husband was escorting a munitions convoy in the North Atlantic. In San Francisco, Mrs. Lucille M. Schultz, a nurse at the Veterans Hospital at Fort Miley, was on night duty when the first announcement was made. She wanted to stay by the radio in hopes the 82nd Airborne would be mentioned. She suspected the division was in the assault, but was also afraid the radio might excite her cardiac patient, a World War I veteran. He wanted to listen to the reports. "I wish I was there," he said. "You've had your war," said Nurse Schultz as she turned off the radio. Sitting in the darkness, weeping silently, she said the rosary over and over for her 21-year-old paratrooper son, Arthur, better known to the 505 Regiment as Private Dutch Schultz. At her home on Long Island, Mrs. Theodore Roosevelt had slept fitfully. Around 3 a.m., she awoke and couldn't get back to sleep. Automatically, she turned on the radio, just in time to catch the official D-Day announcement. She knew it was characteristic of her husband to be somewhere in the thick of the fighting. What she didn't know was that she was likely the only woman in the nation to have a husband on Utah Beach, and a son, 25-year-old Captain Quentin Roosevelt of the 1st Division, on Omaha Beach. Sitting up in bed, she closed her eyes and said an old and familiar family prayer. "O Lord, support us this day until the shadows lengthen and the evening falls." In Stalag 17B, near Krems, Austria, the news was received with joy that could hardly be contained. U.S. Air Force enlisted men had picked up the electrifying announcement on tiny handmade crystal sets, some built to fit inside toothbrush holders, others camouflaged to look like pencils. Staff Sergeant James Lang, who had been shot down over Germany more than a year earlier, was almost afraid to believe it. The camp's news monitoring committee tried to warn the 4,000 prisoners of war against over-optimism. "Don't get your hopes up," they cautioned. "Give us time to verify or deny." But in barracks after barracks, men were already drawing secret maps of the Normandy coast, planning to plot the victorious advance of the Allied armies. At this point, the prisoners of war knew more about the invasion than the German public. So far, the man in the street had heard nothing officially. It was ironic, because Radio Berlin, beating the Eisenhower communique by 3 hours, had been the first to announce the Allied landings. From 6:30 on, the Germans had bombarded a somewhat doubting world with a steady stream of newscasts. These shortwave broadcasts couldn't be heard by the German public. Still, thousands learned of the landings from other sources. Though listening to foreign broadcasts was forbidden and punishable by prison, some Germans tuned in to Swiss, Swedish, or Spanish stations. The news spread swiftly. Many who heard it were skeptical. But there were some, particularly women with husbands in Normandy, who got the report and were deeply concerned. One of these was Frau Verna Plath. She had planned to go to a movie in the afternoon with Frau Sauer, another officer's wife, but when she heard the Allies were rumored to have landed in Normandy, she became nearly hysterical. She immediately called Frau Sauer, who had also heard something about the attack, and canceled the movie date. "I must know what has happened to Werner," she said. "I may never see him again." Frau Sauer was very abrupt and very Prussian. "You shouldn't act like this," she snapped. "You should believe in the Führer and act like a good officer's wife." Frau Plath shot back, "I'll never talk to you again," and slammed down the phone. In Berchtesgaden, it almost seemed the men around Hitler had waited for the official Allied communique before daring to break the news to him. Around 10 a.m., Hitler's naval aide, Admiral Karl Jesko von Puttkamer, called Jodel's office for the latest report. He was told there were definite indications that an important landing had taken place. Gathering all the information he could, Puttkamer and his staff quickly prepared a map. Then Major General Rudolf Schmundt, the Führer's adjutant, awakened Hitler. He was in a dressing gown when he came out of his bedroom. He listened calmly to the reports, and then sent for OKW's chief, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, and Jodl. By the time they arrived, Hitler was dressed and waiting, and excited. The conference that followed, as Puttkamer recalls, was extremely agitated. Information was scarce, but based on what was known, Hitler was convinced this was not the main invasion and kept repeating it. The conference lasted only a few minutes and ended abruptly when Hitler suddenly thundered at Keitel and Jodl, "Well, is it or isn't it the invasion?" Then he turned on his heel and left the room. The subject of releasing the OKW panzer divisions, which von Rundstedt so urgently needed, didn't even come up. At 10:15, the phone rang at Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's home at Herrlingen. The caller was his chief of staff, Major General Hans Speidel, with the first complete briefing on the invasion. Rommel listened, shocked and shaken. It was not a diversionary raid. With all the instinct that had served him so well in his career, Rommel knew this was the day he had said would be the longest day. He waited patiently until Speidel finished, then said quietly, "How stupid of me. How stupid of me." He turned from the phone, and Frau Rommel saw that the call had shaken him. There was terrible tension in the next 45 minutes. Rommel twice called his aide, Captain Helmuth Lang, near Strasbourg. Each time he gave a different hour for their return to La Roche-Guyon. That worried Lang. It was unlike Rommel to be so indecisive. He sounded terribly depressed on the phone, Lang later recalled, and that was not like him either. The departure time was finally set. "We will leave at 1 o'clock sharp from Freudenstadt," Rommel told his aide. Lang assumed Rommel was delaying to see Hitler. He didn't know that at Berchtesgaden, no one but Hitler's adjutant, General Schmundt, even knew Rommel was in Germany. On Omaha Beach, the roar of trucks, tanks, half-tracks, and jeeps nearly drowned out the whine of German 88s. It was the noise of victory. The 4th Division was moving inland faster than anyone had anticipated. On Exit 2, the only open causeway from the beach, 2 men stood directing the flood of traffic. Both were generals. On one side of the road stood Major General Raymond O. Barton, commander of the 4th Division. On the other, the boyishly exuberant Brigadier General Teddy Roosevelt. As Major Gyron Johnson of the 12th Infantry Regiment approached, he saw Roosevelt stomping up and down the dusty road, leaning on his cane and smoking his pipe, as unperturbed as though he were in the middle of Times Square. Roosevelt spotted Johnson and yelled, "Hi, Johnny! Keep right on the road! You're doing fine! It's a great day for hunting, isn't it?" It was a triumphant moment for Roosevelt. His decision to land the 4th 2,000 yards from the planned touchdown point could have been disastrous. Now, watching the long lines of vehicles and men moving inland, he felt immense personal satisfaction. But Barton and Roosevelt, despite their calm air, shared a secret fear. Unless traffic kept moving, the 4th could be stopped cold by a German counterattack. Again and again, the two generals untangled snarled traffic jams. Stalled trucks were ruthlessly shoved off the road. Blazing vehicles, hit by enemy shells, threatened to block the advance, but tanks bulldozed them into the flooded lowlands, where troops sloshed forward. Around 11 a.m., Barton got the good news. Exit 3, just a mile away, was open. He had fought his way nearly 2 miles down the coast and was exhausted, dirty, and battered when he finally met the soldiers of the 4th Division. He stared at them for a moment and asked irritably where they had been. Sergeant Thomas Bruff of the 101st watched a scout from the 4th Division approach from the causeway near Poopaville, carrying his rifle casually like a squirrel gun. The scout looked at Bruff and asked, "Where's the war?" Bruff, who had landed 8 miles off target and fought through the night under General Maxwell Taylor, growled back, "Anywhere from here on back. Keep going, buddy. You'll find it near Audouville-la-Hubert." Captain Thomas M.M.V. of the 101st was hurrying along a dirt road toward the coast when a soldier suddenly appeared from the bushes about 75 yards ahead. Both men dived for cover. They emerged cautiously, rifles ready, and silently stared at each other. The stranger demanded M.V. drop his rifle and advance with his hands up. M.V. suggested the stranger do the same. This standoff went on for several rounds, neither man willing to yield. Eventually, M.V. realized the other man was an American soldier, stood up, and they met in the middle of the road, shook hands, and slapped each other on the back. In Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, Baker Pierre Calron saw paratroopers high in the church steeple waving a big orange identification panel. Soon, a long line of soldiers from the 4th Division marched down the road in single file. Calron lifted his young son, still recovering from a tonsillectomy, onto his shoulders so he wouldn't miss the sight. Suddenly, Calron found himself crying. A stocky American soldier saw him and shouted, "Vive la France!" Calron smiled and nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. As the 4th Division poured inland from Omaha Beach, their D-Day losses were light. 197 casualties, including 60 lost at sea. More brutal fighting awaited, but this was their moment. By nightfall, 22,000 men and 1,800 vehicles were ashore. Together with the paratroopers, they had secured the first major American beachhead in France. At Omaha Beach, soldiers fought savagely for every inch of ground. From the sea, the beach appeared as a scene of unimaginable chaos and destruction. By noon, the situation was so grim that General Omar Bradley aboard the Augusta began contemplating whether to evacuate the beach and redirect reinforcements to Utah and the British sectors. But while Bradley struggled with the decision, on the ground, American soldiers were starting to push forward. Along dog green and dog white sectors, a crusty 51-year-old general named Norman Cota moved through a hail of bullets, waving his .45 and urging the men to move. Behind the seawall and along the beach grass at the base of the bluffs, soldiers crouched shoulder to shoulder, stunned that anyone could be standing and still alive. A group of rangers huddled near the Vierville exit. "Lead the way, Rangers!" Cota shouted. Slowly, men began to rise. Nearby was an abandoned bulldozer loaded with TNT, perfect for breaching the anti-tank wall. "Who drives this thing?" Cota roared. No one answered. Then a red-haired soldier got up, walked to Cota, and said, "I'll do it." Cota clapped him on the back, telling him, "That's the stuff. Now let's get off the beach." Men around them began to move. This was the pattern Cota, assistant commander of the 29th Division, had been setting since his arrival. He took the right half of the sector, while Colonel Charles Canham, wounded and bleeding from the wrist, took the left. Canham moved among the dead and dying, urging groups forward. "They're murdering us here," he said. "Let's move inland and get murdered." Private First Class Charles Ferguson looked up at him and asked, "Who the hell is that rascal?" Then he and the others followed toward the bluffs. On the 1st Division's half of the beach, veterans of Sicily and Salerno recovered faster from the shock. Sergeant Raymond Stroy rallied his men, led them through a minefield, and knocked out a pillbox with a bazooka. He had gone a bit mad. Nearby, Sergeant Philip Streck had enough of being pinned down. Some said he practically kicked men off the beach and through the barbed wire. Captain Edward Wensky met Streck coming back down and saw him step on a telltale mine. "It didn't go off on the way up either," Streck said calmly. Oblivious to the constant shelling, Colonel George A. Taylor of the 16th Infantry stormed up and down his sector, shouting, "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." Leaders of all ranks were showing the way forward. Once they began to move, the men didn't stop. Technical Sergeant William Weld stepped over the bodies of his friends, determined to press on. Second Lieutenant Donald Anderson, wounded in the neck and with the bullet exiting through his mouth, realized at that moment he had become a veteran. Sergeant Bill Courtney of the Rangers reached the top of the ridge and yelled down, "Come on up! The SOBs are cleaned out!" A burst of machine gun fire came from the left. Courtney hurled grenades and shouted again. The troops were advancing. Landing craft began driving up onto the beaches, ramming through obstacles. Others followed, seeing it could be done. Destroyers came so close they nearly ran aground, firing point-blank at enemy strongholds. Under the barrage, engineers worked to finish the demolition tasks they had started nearly 7 hours earlier. Omaha Beach was coming to life. Soldiers were pushing forward. Their fear had turned into fury. Near the top of the Vierville Bluff, Private First Class Carl Wiss and Captain George Whittington spotted a machine gun nest manned by 3 Germans. As they approached, one German saw them and shouted, "Bitter! Bitter! Bitter!" Whittington opened fire, killing them all. He turned to Wiss and asked, "I wonder what bitter means." Out of Omaha's nightmare, American troops were moving inland. By 1:30 p.m., General Bradley received a message that men pinned down on Easy Red, Easy Green, and Fox Red beaches were now advancing. By day's end, the 1st and 29th Divisions had pushed a mile inland. The cost of Omaha was estimated at 2,500 dead, wounded, and missing. Around 1 p.m., Major Werner Pluskat returned to his headquarters at Riva Bella. The man who walked through the door was unrecognizable to his staff. Pluskat was shivering, barely able to speak, asking only for brandy. When it came, he could hardly lift the glass. One officer told him the Americans had landed. Pluskat dismissed him. The biggest concern now was ammunition. The staff said the batteries were nearly out and had reported it to regiment. Colonel Ocker had said supplies were on the way, but nothing had arrived. Pluskat called Ocker. "Are you still alive?" Ocker asked lightly. Ignoring that, Pluskat demanded news about the ammunition. "It's on the way," came the calm reply. Infuriated, Pluskat yelled, "When? You don't understand what it's like here." 10 minutes later, Ocker called back with bad news. The ammunition convoy had been wiped out. Nothing would arrive before nightfall. Pluskat wasn't surprised. He knew nothing could move on the roads. He also knew his guns would be silent by nightfall. He gave orders to prepare for close combat, then wandered through the chateau, feeling useless and alone. He wondered where his dog, Harris, was. By now, the British who had fought D-Day's first battle had been holding the Orne River and Caen Canal bridges for over 13 hours. Major Howard's glider troops, reinforced at dawn, were under constant mortar and small arms fire. They had repelled several counterattacks. Now, anxious and exhausted, they waited for the link-up from the sea. The first reinforcements had arrived, and as the red and green berets mingled, there was a sudden lift in everyone's spirits. 19-year-old Bill Gray felt as if years had fallen off his shoulders. On this crucial day for Hitler's Third Reich, Rommel was racing desperately toward Normandy, while his commanders at the front struggled to hold back the relentless Allied assault. Everything depended on the panzer divisions. the 21st just behind the British beaches, and the 12th SS and Panzer Lehr divisions still held back by Hitler. Field Marshal Rommel watched the thin white ribbon of road stretch ahead and urged his driver onward, shouting for speed. The car roared as his driver pushed the pedal to the floor. They had left Freuden 2 hours earlier, and Rommel had hardly spoken a word. Captain Lang, seated behind him, had never seen the field marshal so silent and depressed. Lang wanted to discuss the landings, but Rommel showed no interest. Suddenly, Rommel turned and looked at Lang. "I was right all along," he said quietly, then stared ahead again. The 21st Panzer Division couldn't get through Caen. Colonel Hermann von Oppeln-Bronikowski, commanding the division's tank regiment, was driving up and down the stalled column in a Volkswagen. The city was a wreck, bombed earlier with devastating results. Rubble filled the streets, and civilians crowded the roads on bicycles trying to escape. There was no hope of getting the tanks through. Bronikowski made the decision to pull back and go around the city, knowing it would take hours, but seeing no other option. Worse still, the regiment of infantry that was meant to support the tanks hadn't arrived. 19-year-old Private Walter Hermes, of the 21st Panzer Division's 192nd Regiment, had never been so thrilled. He was leading the advance on the British and rode his motorcycle proudly ahead of the others. They were heading toward the coast and expected to join up with the tanks soon. Everyone believed that the 21st would push the British back into the sea. Hermes and his friends rode on confidently, entering the 8-mile gap between Juno and Gold beaches that the British commandos still hadn't sealed. This gap could have been a crucial point of attack, but Bronikowski didn't even know it existed. In Paris, Major General Blumentritt, Rommel's chief of staff, called General Speidel at Rommel's headquarters and recorded a short message in Army Group B's war diary. The 12th SS and Panzer Lehr divisions had finally been released by OKW. It was 3:40 p.m. Both generals knew it was too late. Hitler and his staff had delayed these divisions for over 10 hours, and neither would reach the front that day. The 12th SS wouldn't arrive until the morning of June 7th, and the Panzer Lehr, decimated by Allied air attacks, would not arrive until June 9th. Now, everything rested on the 21st Panzer Division. By around 6 p.m., Rommel's staff car pulled into the city commander's headquarters at Caen. Lang placed a call to La Roche-Guyon, and Rommel spent 15 minutes on the phone receiving updates. When he came out, Lang could tell the news was grim. They drove off in silence until Rommel suddenly slammed his gloved fist into his other hand and muttered bitterly about Montgomery. Then he added that if the 21st Panzer Division could make progress, there was a chance to drive the Allies back in 3 days. North of Caen, Bronikowski gave the order to attack. He sent 35 tanks under Captain Wilhelm von Gottberg toward the heights at Perriers, 4 miles from the coast, while he led another group of 25 tanks to Beauville. Generals Edgar Feuchtinger of the 21st Panzer and Erich Marx of the 84th Corps came to watch the attack. Marx approached Bronikowski and told him the future of Germany might rest on his shoulders. Bronikowski saluted and promised to do his best. As the tanks moved out across the fields, Bronikowski was stopped by Major General Wilhelm Richter of the 716th Division. Richter looked distraught, on the verge of breakdown. Tearfully, he told Bronikowski that his division was finished. When asked for their current positions, Richter could only shake his head. He didn't know. Rommel, still riding in the staff car, turned and told Lang he hoped there wasn't a second landing coming from the Mediterranean. After a pause, he added thoughtfully that if he were in command of the Allied forces now, he could end the war in 14 days. Lang had no reply. As Bronikowski's tanks reached the rise at Bouville, they encountered no resistance at first. But as the first tanks reached the top, they were suddenly hit by gunfire from multiple directions. Bronikowski couldn't tell if it was enemy tanks or anti-tank guns, but the fire was deadly accurate. The lead tank exploded without firing a shot. 2 more followed, trying to return fire, but they were ineffective. One after another, tanks were knocked out in rapid succession. Within 15 minutes, 6 tanks were lost. Bronikovsky was stunned by the accuracy and range of British fire and ordered a retreat. Meanwhile, Private Hermes and the Advance Infantry Company reached the coast at Luc-sur-Mer, but found no sign of the tanks or the British. Though puzzled, Hermes was amazed by the massive Allied fleet just offshore. Hundreds of ships moved about, and further out were warships of all kinds. He called it beautiful, comparing it to a parade. With nothing else happening and no orders, Hermes and his friends lounged on the grass and smoked. On the Perrier Heights, the British had already dug in and repelled Gottberg's 35 tanks before they could even open fire. 10 tanks were quickly lost. The delays in movement and the detour around Caen had given the British time to fortify their position. Furious, Gottberg pulled his remaining forces back into a wooded area near Lebus and ordered them to dig in, keeping only the tank turrets exposed. He expected a British counterattack at any moment, but it never came. Around 9 p.m., Gottberg witnessed something astonishing. The roar of engines filled the air as gliders began appearing in formation, silhouetted against the setting sun. Dozens of them flew in steadily, detached from their towing planes, and landed somewhere between him and the coast. Cursing, he realized more Allied forces were pouring in. Back at Bouville, Bronikovsky had dug in his tanks too. He watched in disbelief as German officers with small groups of soldiers retreated toward Caen. Some were dazed, others drunk. At the end of the line, he saw a sergeant holding 2 drunk and swaying German women, singing loudly as they stumbled past. Bronikovsky stood quietly and said, "The war is lost." Rommel's staff car glided into La Roche-Guyon, past the tight row of houses, and into the grounds of the Château de La Roche-Guyon. As the car stopped, Lang ran ahead to inform Major General Speidel of Rommel's arrival. From the main corridor, Lang heard the sound of Wagner's opera coming from Speidel's office. The door opened and Speidel stepped out, smiling. Lang, overwhelmed by the day's events, angrily demanded how he could play music at a time like this. Speidel, still calm, replied that a little music wouldn't stop the invasion. Rommel strode down the corridor in his field coat, carrying his marshal's baton, and entered Speidel's office. He stood silently with his hands behind his back, staring out.